So good afternoon, dear viewers and listeners. My name is Mariia Lihus, and I'm glad to greet you at the first meeting of the cycle of interviews and lectures, Perspectives of Ukrainian Cinema. This meeting is conducted on the basis of the Laboratory of Cinema and Philosophy Research of the Nova Institute of Philosophy at the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities, Nova University, Lisbon. Today, we are going to discuss the phenomenon of Ukrainian cinema and its representation in a wider foreign context. Moreover, we will refer to one of the crucial periods of its history, the Ukrainian poetic cinema movement of 1960s. These issues are the research subjects of our today's expert, who I'm very honored and delighted to introduce. This is Olha Briukhovetska. She holds a PhD in History and Theory of Culture, is an associate professor at the Department of Cultural Studies of the National University Kyiv Mohyla Academy, and co-founder of the Visual Culture Research Center. Dear Olga, thank you for taking your time and agreeing to this meeting.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me and for making such an important series of topic. It's honor for me to be the first guest.
Thank you, Olga. And now I suggest talking about the very notion of Ukrainian cinema as a specific national visual culture and phenomenon, and in general, the plausibility of the concept of national cinema. To pose the first question, I would like to give a quick overview of the history of Ukrainian cinema. We know that Ukrainian cinema appeared at the turn of the 20th century. In 1893, in Odessa, Josip Timchenko exhibited his inventions of recording and projecting moving images, whereas in 1896 in Kharkiv, Alfred Fadetsky demonstrated his first newsreels. The 1920s were the time of flourishing of Ukrainian art and cinema in particular. Ukrainian cinema thrived under the All-Ukrainian Photo Cinema Administration. That was a film organization that governed the entire Ukrainian film industry from production to distribution of films. It successfully operated for almost a decade, but it was closed in 1930 under Stalin's new imperialistic policy. As a result, many Ukrainian films of the 1920s were banned, production infrastructure was destroyed, and artists and filmmakers were repressed. The next prominent stage in the development of Ukrainian cinema was an era of Ukrainian poetic cinema movement of 1960s. It was a time of creative growth and professionalization of Ukrainian cinema, when Ukrainian films gained international recognition. This artistic movement combined visual expressivity, ethnographical symbolism, and camera subjectivity. This movement is associated predominantly with the name of Serhiy Parajanov, a director of Armenian origin, who created a masterpiece of Ukrainian cinema. This is Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors in 1964. However, on the contrary to such rise in 1960s, in 1970s, there was an era of stagnation marked by the policy of Russification under the ideological framework of a single Soviet nation. Later, after Perestroika, which was launched in 1985, and particularly after Ukraine gained independence 6 years later in 1991, the censorship was lifted and new creative possibilities appeared. The Soviet narrative lost its authority, and filmmakers focused on previously forbidden topics. One of them was the restoration of Ukrainian collective memory and revision of national history. For instance, during this period, historical films about the Great Terror, Holodomor, Ukraine in World War II, and Chernobyl were created. The other effect of lifting Soviet censorship was the emergence of action genres that were fashioned after Hollywood films that became accessible during the period of late 80s, early 90s in Ukraine. And Ukrainian cinema was flourishing, production was booming precisely in this period. After this short period of rise, the production of Ukrainian films has been in decline despite the developed infrastructure. Hollywood films dubbed in Russia and sold at low price dominated in Ukraine, whereas Ukrainian cinema had low support from the state due to the economic crisis of 1990s. However, this time several prominent films were created and presented internationally. And they are The Prayer for Hetman Mazepa, filmed by a veteran of Ukrainian poetic cinema, Yuri Ilenko, which participated in the Berlinale competition. And the next film is Mamai. This is the first Ukrainian film to be nominated for Oscar, directed by a young follower of Ukrainian poetic school, Oleh Sanin. However, only after the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, the significance of Ukrainian culture was deeply reconsidered by the state and Ukrainian society. In particular, the state increased financial support of the national cinema, and as a result, many institutions appeared that were called to support the national film industry and also ensure transparency of decision-making. The increase in film production went hand in hand with the increase of interest in Ukrainian cinema, both in Ukraine and internationally. Despite the Russian invasion in 2014, Ukrainian cinema flourished, and it didn't come to the total halt even after the major escalation in February 2022. If we take into consideration such turbulent and complicated history of Ukrainian cinema, it is very interesting how we can talk and consider it as a united and integral phenomenon. In other words, what criteria would be distinguished to consider specific films as Ukrainian films and as those artistic products that represent Ukrainian cultural space? And now I give the floor to our dear expert, Olha.
Thank you, Mariia, for such a wonderful introduction and overview of Ukrainian cinema. As you probably see, it was a sort of bumpy road with rise and falls and repressions and both political and economic. And indeed, this question of what constitutes Ukrainian cinema is really discussed in Ukraine quite intensely. I attribute it partly because also for quite a long there was a big question, what is Ukraine? And so this habit, should I say, of questioning ourselves, which is very typical for the groups that were marginalized, colonized, and regardless within society or as a whole society, this like women know this very well, women of color know this very well, women of color and queer orientation know this very well, this kind of questioning, what are we, where can we find ourselves? So partly that discussion, that question is very relevant because there was also this question, what is Ukraine? Given in consideration that for a really long time, when you go to Europe or elsewhere in the world and you say you are Ukrainian, everyone would like look at, huh? Russia. Not anymore, fortunately, not anymore, but that was the experience that we had since independence, and during Soviet times that was even worse. So that strange question, what is Ukrainian cinema, that Mariia posed, is still, it is very strange question. I don't think any like Portuguese cinema doesn't question itself in this way, what is actually Portuguese. And given the tendency of co-production, that the whole question of where does it belong becomes sort of irrelevant. But in Ukraine, it is a relevant question, since we are going through this, I would say, not on the rise of cultural life despite war, but also rise of this reconsidering our history and finding our own sort of reconciliation with the idea that history is rather tragic. And there are many responses to this question. I have my own, and I'll share it with you. But first, I would like to present the shall I say, dominant way to approach this question, and then I'll explain why I see it somewhat differently. So the dominant way of answering this question, I would say it's like the most extreme version of that dominant way. Is represented by Ukrainian American scholar Yuri Shevchuk, who is at Columbia and at the Russian Eurasian East European Studies Department. The geographical breadth of that and grouping is very, very telling. And here is lecturer in Ukrainian studies. So here his approach, and that's like the extreme version of more mild variation that is predominant in Ukraine, is to really separate those films that were made during Soviet time in a situation where Ukrainian identity was not encouraged very much, or if it was encouraged, it was made in what Yuri Shevchuk aptly calls like funny Ukrainians. So they are not really entirely this kind of fully human, they're sort of funny. And that was internalized. And so Yuri Shevchuk's idea was to really separate those films that didn't fall under the category, either not representing Ukrainians at all, sort of what he calls cinematic depopulation, as a kind of, I would say, some on-screen Holodomor, so starve Ukrainian identity, so it's like dissolve it, it doesn't exist. Or presenting Ukrainians as this like funny, not really human beings. And then this like core Ukrainian films that represent national identity. And as a way of answering this question, what is Ukrainian, the question that comes from the whole basically situation of being colonized culturally and politically for 300 years plus, that's understandable. That seems like a kind of right solution. We should separate those cultural texts, films included, that addressed Ukrainian identities and those that sort of did not. But I see this as a maybe understandable, but not the best way to talk about Ukrainian cinema, because Ukrainian cinema and Ukrainian history is history of everything. So that's my approach. Those films that didn't address Ukrainian identity, they were also produced in Ukraine, and they're indicative of the processes that we as a group went through. So that doesn't make sense for me to exclude those works. Rather, I would suggest that's my version, like instead of solving this question in essentially terms, what is Ukraine, what is Ukrainian identity, what are Ukrainian films, which film is Ukrainian and which not, to look at the whole situation and pose this question within a framework of like the situation of being colonized. Since Vuvko was closed in 1930, every Ukrainian film that was produced in Ukraine during Soviet time was obliged to be to receive permission from Moscow like 5 times during the production. So it was heavily not only censored but also supervised. So that's the situation that Ukrainian cinema existed for the most of its history. And taking that situation and taking fluctuation of political environment more friendly to freedom of expression, less friendly. This is all is the history of Ukrainian cinema, within which we can see different responses to this situation. So one response would be when it was quite friendly, relatively friendly environment for the more like questions of, okay, how do we talk about Ukraine? How we ask those questions? Can we talk? How can we show it? There was this response, which mostly known as Ukrainian poetic cinema, the great phenomena which we will talk more in detail today. But there were other responses also during 60s. There was other way to approach it, to approach this situation. And this is also part of Ukrainian cinema, part of Ukrainian history, and another way to respond to the situation that we faced. So for me, this question, what is Ukrainian cinema, is quite interesting and important in terms that that's the indication that we were forced to find ourselves in a situation when we have to question ourselves. And that's not necessarily bad. I mean, as long as we're
Olga, something is with the internet connection, unfortunately. I cannot hear you and see you now. Okay.
Maybe write her an email and tell her that she should reconnect.
Now again.
Focus on our major topic. So I think that's the good way to approach it, and I usually think when I'm talking about different responses in terms of what Stuart Hall, British, one of the founder of British cultural studies and kind of theoretician of culture, he was talking about encoding the decoding model and 3 ways to respond to the dominant discourse. And dominant discourse was the discourse of Russocentric etatism, if we use David Brandenberger very precise terms. So there was this Russian state, and Russian people represented this state, and that state represented the future of all humanity, that bright, radiant future, and all the other nations, if they wanted to have that future, they should join Russian people and Russian state. So that was more or less the dominant framework through the whole Soviet period. And then there were different responses. Hegemonic, yes, we join this movement, but we will never be like Russians. We will be a little bit always different, but we will try to erase that difference. There will be negotiated, this funny Ukrainians version, and there will be counter-hegemonic or positional discourse. And all these 3, and there are much more, I would think it's more nuanced, all these 3 responses are indicative of Ukrainian cinema, Ukrainian culture, and our history.
Thank you. So I guess we can approach the phenomenon of Ukrainian cinema as very multidimensional and the one that unites different perspectives. And to create one of these perspectives, it's also interesting to see how other cultures perceive Ukrainian cinema. And they can do that referring to particular films, particular works, and particular figures that represent Ukrainian cinema. So I'm very interested and curious what prominent films and names in Ukrainian cinema are known in the world.
Yeah, so this is another very important moment. We of course exist in Ukraine as a Ukrainian cinema, but it's also very important to understand that we are recognized from outside, and this is also has been a sort of not a straight line for Ukrainian cinema. I'll start from nowadays and then move backwards. And we know past always changes with present, so it's a different past that should we say 10 years ago or something like this. So since the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, as Mariia mentioned, there was this renaissance or new wave of Ukrainian cinema. The new generation of filmmakers appeared, and there was this very similar to French New Wave situation of state funding that was not corrupt and transparent and actually quite generous comparing to the previous times during the independence of Ukraine. So there were quite a lot of new names in Ukrainian cinema, and those names become visible outside in the international field. The first name I would mention, though, is a Ukrainian filmmaker that became known not as a filmmaker per se, but as a prisoner of Russian regime. It's Oleg Sentsov. His name is probably the most known name of associated with Ukraine among all over the world. We know all these international campaigns, Johnny Depp with whatever that was Johnny Depp prior to Me Too scandals. But so Oleg Sentsov was captured in 2014 in Crimea in 2014, illegally was accused of terrorism, which was, of course, a false accusation, and was sentenced in 2015 for 20 years in prison. And he happened to be a filmmaker that did this film about computer games, which was very little known in Ukraine, but then he became this symbol of Ukrainian culture, captured, destroyed, silenced by Russian occupation. And he was released in 2019 due to the exchange of prisoners, and since then, he actually became quite like a face of Ukrainian cinema and its resilience. And he made this film Rhino in 2021, and that film represents this kind of return to the 90s. There was this the whole wave of films that reconsidered 90s. For Ukraine, 90s were a really harsh time of neoliberal economy going really wild and wiping out all the social welfare system. There was criminality going on, corruption, disorientation, and confusion. And so those times were quite violent and not easy to go through. And so this 90s mood that we thought probably already in past, but now we of course know, we feel the return in much more horrific ways of those violent energies. So this mood of 90s best represented by a quite well-known Ukrainian film from this period of after Revolution of Dignity, the film Tribe, or The Tribe by Miroslav Sabushpitsky, that was awarded in 2014. So the film was made before the Revolution of Dignity, but it was released almost simultaneously with the Russian occupation of Crimea, and it was kind of the synonym of Ukraine in the cinematic field. And it's an extremely powerful film that's about contemporary Ukraine and set in the boarding school for deaf and numb teenagers, and that deafness and numbness was kind of the symbol of powerlessness of people, although Maidan showed that Ukrainian people are not that powerless and they can say no quite well. But the film was conceived and made prior to Revolution of Dignity, and that energy of protest is really felt in that film. So somehow it resonated quite well in terms of what the image of Ukraine outside Ukraine was, and it's a powerful film. There are no words spoken, and it's all like based on gestures, and the actors are not professional, and I mean it's extremely strong film that got shown many festivals, got many awards, including European Oscar, and that film captures both the mood, sort of brings this line of 90s, hardcore 90s, and to today's Ukraine right before the revolution. Then I should mention, of course, a few other names, just those that are visible, most visible today. This is Valentin Vasyanovich, a filmmaker who prominently was featured in Venice Festival. Venice Festival is quite Ukraine-centric and shows quite a lot of Ukrainian films in program, and Valentin Vasyanovich with his film Reflection was festival, and that was the first Ukrainian film ever presented in the competition. There is also like this Ukrainian comedy films, and even though comedy for Ukraine now became quite a strong kind of word, because our president was a comedian before he became a president. Volodymyr Zelensky was a stand-up comedian, had his own comedy club. So we do have this Ukrainian comedy, which is kind of hardcore and very dark, I would say, because otherwise you won't survive in Ukraine. And we have this, like the most probably well-known outside of Ukraine filmmaker who specializes on this dark comedy is Antonio Lukic, and his film My Thoughts Are Silent was quite went through this kind of festival cycle, and then during the war in autumn 2022 he managed to finish his second film, which is called Luxembourg, and it was presented in Venice in Horizons program. And this is the film, again, a comedy about 90s. So this 90s, the time to reflect how we became independent, but not through the mythology of this national suffering, but through this hardcore reality test and memories of those times. So this is like big topic in Ukrainian cinema. And of course, there is another big topic in Ukrainian cinema, and this is war. And I would name two like groups of filmmakers. Of course, it's much wider, but those who are visible, this is like Crimea Tatar, filmmakers, and particularly Mariia Lihus in his film Homeward. It was presented at Cannes Film Festival in 2019. It's a Crimea Tatar perspective on the war in Ukraine. And then there is like huge group of female filmmakers, like among those who debuted with feature films, like women take the leading role. And I would name just very few of those from this group, and those are quite well-known films about the war. It's Irina Tsilik, The Earth is Blue as an Orange, and Natalka Vorozhbit, Bad Roads, was shot in 2020. So this is just a very brief outline of Ukrainian cinema after revolution, and I actually would like to show this issue of film magazine, which is published in French. It's called 24 Frames. It's an autumn issue dedicated specifically to Ukrainian cinema after revolution. So from 2013 to 2022, this film magazine is French-Canadian film magazine based in Montreal, and I think more of such special issues are on the way. Or hopefully they are on the way, because there is this phenomenon of Ukrainian cinema after the Revolution of Dignity, and this is already some kind of big place to understand how young filmmakers, and predominantly young and a lot of women filmmakers, how they reflect this harsh reality that we are facing since beginning of the war, because Maidan ended with the beginning of Russian invasion in 2013. I should also mention that I have a short entry in this magazine dedicated to the presence of Ukrainian poetic cinema and its relevance for today. And I think the last part of my answer to this question would go backwards in the history to the time when Ukrainian cinema was perceived abroad, was visible. If we look back and see when Ukrainian cinema was also visible for outside of Ukraine, that would be in 1964, when film The Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors by Sergei Parajanov was first screened at the Argentinian Film Festival at Mar del Plata. This festival doesn't exist anymore, but they have put the archives of that period of time when they were operative, and that film received the award for the camera work there. But the camera work actually, at the time when the film was presented, was at the time there was this idea that filmmaker creates the narrative and cameraman creates the picture. That was not the case in Shadows, because Parajanov is a filmmaker who does not create narrative but creates picture, and there was this big struggle between cameraman Yuri Ilyenko, who right after this shooting of Shadows became filmmaker himself, and Parajanov on how the film should look like. And out of that big and rush struggle, this like amazing, unexpected, because Parajanov was known for making 4 mediocre films, which actually are quite interesting and very unknown outside of Ukraine. Interesting in terms of their failures to obey to the narrative conventions, and their interesting failures. So basically, with that film, The Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, shot in a time when in Ukraine there was still quite a lot of freedom. The the head of Ukrainian Communist Party was relatively liberal Petro Shelest, and he was ousted only in 1972. So stagnation in Ukraine started quite much later than it started in Russia, when Khrushchev was thrown out of his leadership position in 1964, so like right kind of on the border of the beginning of general stagnation in Soviet Union. This really amazing, unexpected, and completely un-Soviet film, and that was the kind of the general consensus that this film doesn't fit to any idea of Soviet cinema. And Parajanov is known himself to say, when he was asked to write his biography for the Encyclopedia of Soviet Cinema, he's known to say, "I'm not a Soviet filmmaker." So he was like this kind of dangerously free person in a society that didn't value the freedom. But that film, somehow, there was this historical moment when this film was able to get through the Iron Curtain, and Soviet officials didn't deem it too dangerous to show Ukrainian film, which didn't fit to the ideas of Soviet cinema, and that film really was a sensation. For the film community, there was this memoirs of Vyacheslav Vsevolod Ivanov, who was one of the godfathers of this Ukrainian poetic cinema. He had this administrative position in state cinema institution who was supporting these young rebellious experimental films, which touched those kind of dangerous topics in terms of what was allowed in Soviet Union. And he remembered that there was this very famous film critic running through the festival hall, and after the screening of Shadows, and shouting, "Who is Sergei Parajanov? Why don't I know this name? I know all the important filmmakers. Why don't I know him?" And unfortunately, Parajanov was not allowed to accompany the film because he was too dangerous. He could say anything and embarrass Soviet authorities. He was notorious for that, and that was part of the reason why he was persecuted during Soviet time. So Shadows got through the Iron Curtain. It's run in Paris. There was one cinema that showed Shadows for about 3 months without break. It was a sensation all over the world. Many countries bought this film, which for Soviet authorities who really loved money was a good sign. So that time was a time when Ukrainian cinema became visible, but it was not really straightforwardly visible, because even if I'm reading some of the reviews of that period of Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, and some film critics were not really sure whether it was a Ukrainian or Russian film. They were so used to calling everything that would come from Soviet Union Russian, that even this film that didn't fit at all to the idea of what Russia is still was quite often referred to as Russian film. So there was part of film reviews that mentioned it as a Ukrainian film, but there were quite a lot of those who would call it beautiful Russian fairy tale. And then we have to, unfortunately, this period when Ukrainian poetic cinema was allowed to be seen outside of Ukraine was very short, and those films that followed in the footsteps of Parajanov and developed this innovative aesthetics, they were not allowed to be shown outside. They were actually, most of them were banned, or were even if not banned, the film project distribution within Ukraine was not encouraged of those films. and outside of Ukraine they were not known at all. And then if we go backward to the 20s, we also have this period when Ukrainian cinema was visible, mostly known as and known by a figure of Alexander Dovzhenko, who was also through the whole 20th century was also quite often referred to as a part of Russian avant-garde cinema. So we still have to reclaim a lot of from this kleptomania, Russian kleptomania in field of culture, or this inertia of seeing everything that has relation to Soviet Union as Russian. But yes, 20th would be the time to look and reorganize Ukrainian history and actually reclaim a lot of names or show some names that were not visible as well.
Thank you for such a great mapping of the landscapes of Ukrainian cinema nowadays and back in the history. And now I would like to turn to the topic of your scholarly interest. This is Ukrainian poetic cinema and to its notion. What was it, and was it just a specific phenomenon of Ukrainian culture, or maybe poetic cinema was inscribed in some wider tendencies?
Yes, thank you for this question. Indeed, I'm working on a book-length study of Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, which I call the film that everyone saw in Ukraine, but actually no one have actually seen it yet. So there is this certain routine perception of shadows as this like beacon of national identity, which I intend to dismantle and to show this almost queerness of this film, and the film that is based on multiple operations of this identification. And that's an interesting task, and I think quite pedagogical in terms of that we don't have to be so much obsessed about what is Ukraine, and that question can give productive answers, but it's not a repressive question that we should bring some kind of object and show this is Ukraine. So back to your question about how shall we define Ukrainian poetic cinema, which is really one of the most important and bright phenomena in Ukrainian culture. If we take not only the period of 60s, the Thaw period in Soviet culture, but also generally Ukrainian culture in general. And there is this essentialistic tendency to think about Ukrainian poetic cinema as something very Ukrainian, which I totally understand as a part of the reclaiming national identity and facing this question, and do you really exist? It was a necessary step, but a step that hopefully we will come over and start to look at this phenomena from the wider perspective, and that's one of the directions that I'm exploring. And one of the parallel would be, of course, the parallel that many do with European New Wave cinema. And with that European New Wave cinema, we would have the kind of connective moment with Pier Paolo Pasolini's text, Cinema of Poetry, which was his speech, his presentation at Pesaro Film Festival on early September 1965, almost simultaneously with the very famous premiere of Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors in Kyiv, about which we will talk a little bit later. But Pasolini talks about poetic cinema or cinema of poetry in terms that are very helpful to understand what was going on in Ukraine, and he obviously didn't see Parajanov's film. He didn't know that it was poetic cinema in Ukraine, but there was this kind of simultaneity of exploration, of thinking, of visions that is very interesting. The other area that we can also look at is actually where Pasolini took this term. He didn't invent it, although Italian film scholars really truly believe that he invented this term. Pasolini was referring to French avant-garde, and that's where the poetry metaphor for cinema actually first was conceived, and it traveled not only in Europe to Pasolini text, but not solely to that text, but also it traveled through connection with the so-called Russian avant-garde, but not particularly only Russian. It was Dovzhenko who obviously knew about these things, and also, but mostly through Russian formalist group. And Eisenstein would be the key figure in this discussion. There was this late 20s, early 30s discussion in Soviet theory of filmmaking. What is the best model for cinema, poetry or prose? Then this adoption of socialist realism as the only and correct method for the art in 1933, this discussion, of course, became irrelevant. But then in the 60s, this idea of poetic cinema resurfaced, and actually resurfaced first with Tarkovsky's film Ivan's Childhood. And Tarkovsky embraced this idea of poetic cinema. And then he actually really opposed this when he noticed that after the release of Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, that there is another poetic cinema, and the one that is bright and colorful and doesn't represent this ethnically neutral concept of intellect, but is very heavily bodily different. And so Tarkovsky, who did have imperialistic tendencies, as many Russian cultural figures, unfortunately, and this should be also taken in account, he really opposed this idea of poetic cinema, referring now to Ukrainian phenomena. Later, he actually got again into this idea, and after arrest of Parajanov, he actually changed his opinion about Parajanov. So it's a complicated and not one black and white story, but so there was this whole tendency of poetic cinema as a concept floating around. Moreover, to complicate the whole story, during this Renaissance period in 60s Ukrainian cinema, the term poetic cinema was one of many. There was also painterly cinema, which Parajanov really liked because he was insistent that he doesn't look at film as a story, he looks at it as a series of paintings. And if you look at Parajanov's film, even his early socialist realist so-called phase, you can see that kind of perception of cinema as a series of paintings, and that is like totally makes story totally irrelevant. So Parajanov was really fond of that idea of painterly cinema. And there was this another term which I think goes back to the French avant-garde, and that's the really beautiful term, associative cinema. So it kind of goes to this idea of free association and associationism. So this like also psychoanalytic intellectual field comes in play. And Parajanov was also using that term, and actually he took it from his teacher at Moscow film school, Igor Savchenko, who was also Ukrainian filmmaker working in Moscow. Similarly to Alexander Dovzhenko, they were not allowed to work in Ukraine during Stalinist time. So Igor Savchenko was talking about, although he was more straightforward, realistic socialist, he made mostly social realist films with some interesting twists. He was talking and teaching his students about thinking in associations. And that of course had its intellectual field somehow inscribed in this idea, and Parachanov was also playing with this term of associative cinema. So this is a very complex question, how we approach. Sometimes it's useful to have labels like Ukrainian poetic cinema or Ukrainian School of Poetic Cinema. That was the kind of name that became known in 60s, early 70s. But it's also extremely important to understand that behind those labels, there is not one essence. There is this many practices, many lines that cross and form these interesting patterns. And so not to get in trap of this kind of one thing and behind one label, because there were many things behind this label of Ukrainian poetic cinema.
Thank you. The film, The Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, I guess it's the one that we mentioned today the most. And I would like to talk about this film. In 2021, it was recognized as the best film in the history of our national cinema. According to the rating that was initiated by Dovzhenko Center, it is a Ukrainian National Cinema Archive. There was a large survey conducted among Ukrainian film critics, and I know that you were one of them. This survey was aimed to reconsider the national cinema and define top 100 Ukrainian films. And Shadows, directed in 1964 by Serhiy Parachanov, is #1 in this list of the best films. It seems that the title of this film points to the past only, but you mentioned today a lot that, and I think that no doubt that it appeared to be #1 in the list of the best films, then it has to be relevant even nowadays. So how does this film unite the past and the present?
Thank you, Maria. Yes, this is indeed a very, very good question, and I'll start with the past and present. The whole perception of Ukrainian poetic cinema, that label, somehow useful label, but we shouldn't get hypnotized by it, that is like really important for Ukraine and maybe outside of Ukraine. That label has certain obvious in quotation marks things like features of Ukrainian poetic cinema, and it happened, and there was reason for this, that most films that belong to this school, and they are quite different films, but they are all somehow they have this two features. They are talking about Ukrainian past, and that particular Ukrainian past that was not encouraged by the dominant Soviet narrative. So those kind of gaps of Ukrainian past, whatever was possible in a situation of censorship, so usually it's through the classical or recognized by Soviet canon pre-revolutionary Ukrainian writers. So if you have this writer in a school textbook, you can play with his text and start talking about many things, but using this sort of alibi of this famous literary names. Or the otherwise, like sort of making double narrative. There will be this official narrative, but behind it you can sense and see that there is another narrative. So this is part like the thematic part, like going to Ukrainian past and trying to talk about things that were not so easy to talk because they were censored. And because of that, partly, there is this experimentation with form. So experimentation with form, this poetic part, helps to bring those forbidden ideas, topics, things in a poetic form that censors kind of are blind to it, because censors can censor the information, but with poetry they're sort of helpless, and that's how you can beat them. So there was this I would call it articulation of an articulation in terms of Stuart Hall or Laclau and Mouffe, this kind of non-necessary belongingness of two components that somehow in these historical circumstances created this situation in which they combined this experiment with form and this topical direction, sort of subversive topics on repressed national moments. So, and because of the nature of labels that they present themselves as something very obvious, that idea that Ukrainian poetic cinema should be always about past somehow became a part inscribed in the whole kind of cultural field. And this is unfortunate because I see another and more productive ways to talk about poetic cinema that are more relevant to the situation where, for example, you don't have censorship, right? You don't have censorship, you can talk freely in Ukraine today. We don't have censorship on anything, mostly. Like, I do not know, probably denial of Russian aggression would be censored, but not that many people really want to do that. And so how you make relevant this idea of poetic cinema, those films made in 60s or the 70s under totally different circumstances today. And that's my approach to this is that you see that they are not necessarily have to be about past. You can also talk about these moments of, I call it poetic burning. There are these moments, experiences in life that are so difficult and extreme that you cannot really realistically represent them. You have to go through this poetic burning point. And it's very helpful to understand that those moments should not necessarily be in past. They can be in the present. Moreover, what is helpful is to look at those films in 60s poetic cinema as also films that actually are very much rooted in present. Although they look as if it's only about past, this is actually extremely interesting challenge to see in them those moments of present and, or like, shall we say, impurity of time where everything is mixed, where that they are really relevant for that time in history when they were created. For example, in Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, this I would use here Raymond Williams' now fortunately again famous concept, structure of feeling, that structure of feeling of failure that was actually the kind of that there is no future at all, that there is only past, that mood, that structure of feeling was very pointed to the time of, like, after 1969, it became very obvious when Prague Spring was oppressed and everyone in Soviet Union understood that the future is not bright and the state is absolutely repressive, and any efforts to change it, to make some kind of adjustment to this idea of socialism and present it in a more human face, that it's total failure. But that sense was there earlier, and somehow, like, the time of end of Sao, that was the moment of when bright future, the cosmic exploration, the kind of promise of technical progress suddenly showed its really illusionary character. So there is an interesting joke that at this moment the radiant future disappeared, and all people started looking at the radiant past. That kind of nostalgic shift. And that film really captures this sense of sudden loss of future, that there is no future, there is only past and nothing to look ahead, only remember how it was at the beginning, because it's a story of lost love of the main character who tries to overcome. He goes through this period of grief, and actually this was not in a novel of Mohyla, who was this alibi author from kind of early Impressionism in Ukrainian literature. It's a novel from 1911. So this main character goes through the period of grief, and that period is like really shows probably the closest to experience of Gulag ever shown on Soviet screen. This black and white depression, suffering, isolation, total separation from people, like being dead but alive at the same time, but not really alive. And then he tries to live again, but it doesn't work. It simply doesn't work, so he dies. That's the best what happens to him. So that's the film that shows the mood of the present time. And of course, at the present moment, we look at this film. Most of Ukrainians look at this film as the idea of resilience of culture, because despite what I just told you is a very sad story, it's also extremely a story of extreme beauty and of extreme celebration of life, and that contradiction somehow is within this film. And for Ukrainian cultural field today, this film absolutely stays for this like unbroken tradition and resilience of life, and the beauty of Ukrainian culture, traditional culture of Hutsuls. It's an ethnic group that resides in Carpathian Mountains, far in the west of Ukraine. And all those contradictions are really extremely interesting to look at. And also to understand that that's this hybrid nature of present moment that also contains the past and future and place and many layers of them, that we can also talk in these terms about today. So it's more like a model of what you do, of what Parajanov did, or of what other filmmakers of poetic school did with their materials, how they combined past, future and present, that I think can be very inspiring for today's filmmakers. Not just look at this as a kind of classical films that you cannot even touch, but really work with those films. And that's actually the main point of my contribution to this magazine, that you can actually not just look at it, but also do these operations that Parachanov did. And to illustrate this point, I would like to show a small scene from this film. It's considered to be the key scene of Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, although I partly disagree, because I think this is the film that contains many films in itself, depending on which scene you consider the key scene. So it's like actually like the round sphere with many doors, and which door you enter, you have a totally different experience, but it's like the same celluloid film or like digital file. You just can have totally different experiences with this. But one of the possible ways to talk about this film is to look through this scene. And this is a scene after the main character, Ivan, had lost his love of his life, went through this black and white period of extreme grief and loss of sense of reality, and then tried again to have sort of normal life. So he marries his this really earthly woman, Palahna, and this is the moment of their wedding, and it's accompanied by an extremely beautiful folk song, which is called Verbovaya Doshechka, which is a song about wedding, and Parajanov really loved this song, and actually there are videos where he sings this song and says it's like this is it. That's about the marriage. That's about what happens. And if you look at this episode, try to reflect what does it talk about. Not only like traditions of Hutsuls, which actually are far away from what is shown on the screen, but about our experience of marriage and what it is for us. And I think that's the moment where the concepts of present and past and future are really together in this episode. So I'll start sharing my screen and show you this. It's just 1 minute episode. I could talk about this 1 minute for probably 1 hour because there is so much in it. But hopefully sometimes there will be a special lecture about this particular episode. I would just briefly mention something totally marginal. But if you look at the first, if you remember that really strange first frame where there is the, like most of the screen is black, and think about aspect ratio that was in 65 absolutely unacceptable, but it's now like mobile phone aspect ratio, and to make something like this on the screen and then actually put the lid of it down and show like totally change the reality. And every second of that episode is a little discovery, and there is a extremely interesting subversion of everything happening right during this performance of this totally invented by Parajanov ritual, but that's another story, and will take really long time for me to unpack everything what's going on, but to just get the mood of this. So.
Thank you, and thank you for such a great illustration. I think it's very important when we can approach to the film by watching it at least for 1 minute. And I also believe that this topic deserves a separate talk or lecture maybe later. We know that Sergei Parajanov was arrested in 1973 under the pretext of his homosexuality, and he was sentenced to 5 years of labor camps. His reaction to this injustice was embodied in his famous words, "I will revenge on Ukraine with great love." In this context, I would like to ask you, is it plausible to perceive his work and his film, Shadows in particular, as manifestations of Ukrainian cultural resistance to the Soviet regime? And if yes, then was he alone in such struggle? Or maybe he was surrounded by other artists who also expressed their cultural resistance in their artistic works?
Thank you so much. Yes, this phrase, I will revenge on Ukraine with great love, is the key of what Parajanov was about, because he did revenge, but his revenge was to transform that world with his vision, and this he never had that separation between life and work. So this was constant creation and of situations, of environments, of processes, of rituals, and that's why he was so dangerous for Soviet regime, because he was consciously apolitical person. So he was making jokes about real dissidents who were reading Lenin and Marx and trying to show to Soviet authorities that they understand them superficially. As one of these very famous cinephile of, there was this cinephilic dissidents, and this is he is now in Russia, film historian Margolin, but he is originally from Donbas region. He told, after they were arrested, like late 60s, for just screening films and discussing them, he told, like, to his friend, we thought that they superficially understand Marx, but they do not care about Marx. They're just interested in raw power. Parajanov was not dissident as such. Dissidents were fighting for human rights and showing Soviet constitution, which was very good on paper, to authorities and saying, like, hey, follow these things you're supposedly governing on, based on. And Parajanov never really was into that part of activity. He was making jokes about Marx and like didn't really take seriously all the serious topics that dissidents, especially left-wing dissidents, because dissidents were very different. There were also those who were like really on the right. But this kind of progressive left-wing dissident movement of defending human rights, there was not much of that in Parajanov, although he would always sign letters against opposing arrests and petitions to free some unjustly jailed artist or cultural figure or just person. And he was he actually had his political views, but they were not the most important. And he expressed his sense of freedom in much more, shall I say, associative way. Like there was this constant float of creation of things and people around him, and he would just like make this huge amount of cultural oxygen around him. So he was actually a really dangerous person, because people would feel free in oppressed society just simply by seeing such person and being like in that magnetic field. And he did have big influence on people. I think many people mentioned that he was able to hypnotize people, and people like hypnotize them out of unfreedom. But of course he was not alone, and we mentioned briefly the premiere, very famous premiere of Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, which took place on the 5th of September 1965, right? Almost the same day when Pasolini presented his Cinema of Poetry idea and text at Pesaro Film Festival, without knowing what's going on in Kyiv. And there is this key film of Ukrainian poetic cinema presented. And why this premiere was so important, because during this premiere there was this like presentation of the film crew. Parajanov made a small presentation of everyone. And then what happened that a person came on the stage. This person is really very well-known literary scholar, Ivan Dzyuba. At that time, he was 35-year-old PhD student, and he took a microphone, he brought flowers, gave it to not the leading actor, but the person who was responsible for costumes, who didn't get flowers. That's very Ivan Dzyuba approach. He really was one of this deeply democratic thinking person, cultural figure. And then he said that there were arrests of cultural figures that summer, so this 5th of September, and then in August there were arrests, and he said we should oppose this new great terror coming, and those who are against oppression, please rise up. And very few people got up from their seats, so there was like sense of that was almost the same like in the film. There is no future. We are too few. There was one of the people who stood up was Vasyl Stus, Ukrainian poet and extremely brave person who died in Gulag in 1995 after he, just 1 year before Perestroika, was launched in late 1995, early 1986. He died in labor camp in Mordovia, deep in Russia, where Gulag, this territory of Gulag during Stalinist time. And he was arrested exactly for his poems, for his political position, for his fight against oppression of Ukrainian language, against the arrests, against the criminality of KGB that was some that killed some other cultural figures like Ukrainian artist Alla Horska. She was just murdered in her studio during this time, during the time when Ukrainian soul has finished. And in 1972, the Moscow changed the leader of Ukraine, and there was this a strong wave of repressions during which Parajanov was also arrested, and Vasyl Stus and some cultural figures were just murdered secretly. There was also singer Ivasyuk, the very famous singer who was singing these Ukrainian songs that became extremely popular all over Soviet Union. He was murdered and tortured before he was